Sometimes, the loudest heartbreak in the room is not a cry, but the silence left behind by someone who should still be there. In the very front row of the grand wedding hall sat a single empty wooden chair. Resting carefully upon it was a framed photograph of a smiling father, whose presence once held the entire family together. The glowing lights of the magnificent hall reflected softly against the glass frame, making it almost feel as though he were still watching over them somehow. Around that lonely chair sat relatives dressed in their finest clothes, quietly avoiding eye contact with the painful reminder sitting only inches away. Everyone in that room understood the same heartbreaking truth. Some losses are simply too heavy for words, and no matter how beautiful the day may appear from the outside, grief always finds a way to sit beside you. Behind the massive oak doors stood Sarah, frozen between two worlds, one final moment as someone's daughter, and one painful step toward becoming a wife without her father there to guide her forward. Her breathing was uneven, shallow, trembling beneath the weight of emotions she had spent months trying desperately to contain. As a little girl, she used to dream about this exact moment: the beautiful white dress, the glowing candles, the warm smile of her father proudly standing beside her. But reality had rewritten the ending of that dream completely. Now there was only silence behind those heavy doors. Silence, and heartbreak waiting patiently on the other side. Her trembling hands clutched a bouquet of faded yellow roses so tightly that a few delicate petals had already begun falling softly to the floor. Those flowers were not chosen for beauty alone. They were chosen because they had been his favorite. Every Sunday morning, her father used to bring yellow roses home for the family dining table, tiny reminders of warmth and ordinary happiness. Now those same roses had become symbols of grief, memory, and love that refused to disappear. Sarah stared quietly at the flowers as tears gathered in her eyes once more. She wasn't carrying a bouquet down the aisle. She was carrying the memory of the man who was supposed to walk beside her. Hidden quietly within the shadows of the hall stood Elias, nervous, pale, silent, a young man so overwhelmed by grief that even standing upright looked difficult for him. While everyone else whispered softly or comforted one another in small groups, Elias remained alone with his thoughts. He had always been quiet long before tragedy entered their lives. But after losing his father, something inside him seemed to close completely. Some people scream when their hearts break. Others shatter silently, disappearing deeper and deeper into themselves until nobody knows how to reach them anymore. Elias had become one of those people. He watched the room carefully from a distance, desperately wanting to say something meaningful to his sister, but feeling trapped inside a silence he could no longer escape. For weeks, Elias watched Sarah slowly fall apart piece by piece. Every late-night cry behind closed bedroom doors, every forced smile during wedding planning, every moment she paused after hearing someone mention their father casually in conversation. He noticed it all. He carried every painful detail inside himself. More than anything, he wanted to comfort her, wanted to tell her she was not alone in this nightmare, wanted to somehow become strong enough for both of them. But grief had stolen the simplest words from his mouth. Every sentence felt trapped inside his chest before it could ever reach the air. The harder he tried to speak, the tighter anxiety wrapped around his throat like invisible chains. And slowly, Elias began believing that silence was the only thing he had left to offer the world. In the dusty corner of their childhood home sat an old upright piano, forgotten now, untouched, covered gently in shadows and silence. Once, that piano had been the warm heartbeat of the house, but after their father passed away, the instrument became something entirely different. A painful reminder of everything they had lost. Sunlight no longer danced across its wooden surface the way it used to. Music no longer echoed through the hallways. The room itself felt colder somehow, empty in ways furniture and walls alone could never explain. It was almost as though the piano itself had entered mourning alongside the family. But once upon a time, that same piano filled the home with life. Every Sunday morning, their father would sit on the wooden bench with a warm smile and call little Elias over beside him. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen, while soft melodies floated gently throughout the house. Tiny fingers stumbled awkwardly across the keys, while a patient father guided them lovingly back into rhythm. Those mornings were never perfect, but they were full of warmth, full of laughter, full of life. Their father used to tell Elias something he never forgot. Music speaks when words fail. At the time, Elias never fully understood what that meant, but standing years later inside the ruins of grief, those words now echoed louder than ever before. The day their father died, the piano lid closed tightly, and nobody opened it again. Days became weeks, weeks became months. Dust slowly settled across the instrument like silent snowfall. Sometimes Sarah would walk past the living room and quickly look away before the memories became too painful. Sometimes Elias would stand in the doorway late at night, staring at the piano from a distance, unable to move any closer. Grief doesn't only break hearts. Sometimes it silences the very things that once made us feel alive. The music stopped because the family no longer knew how to exist inside a world where their father's voice was missing. Late at night, Elias sat alone at his small wooden desk, trying desperately to write a speech for Sarah. Just a few simple words. That was all he needed. But the blank page in front of him felt larger than the entire room. He picked up the pen carefully, his trembling fingers struggling even to hold it steady. "Dad would be proud of you," he whispered softly to himself. But before he could write another sentence, panic began tightening painfully in his chest. His breathing became shallow, his thoughts blurred together, and suddenly the words felt impossible again. Frustrated tears filled his eyes as he violently crumpled the paper in his shaking hands. Once again, silence had won. Days before the wedding, Elias finally stood before the old piano again. The room was dark except for the soft gray light of rain slipping quietly through the nearby window. His heart pounded violently as he reached toward the exposed yellowed keys. His fingertips trembled only inches above them. One note, that was all he needed to play, just one. But grief can make even the smallest step feel impossible. Every memory came rushing back at once. His father's voice, his laughter, the warmth of those Sunday mornings. Elias squeezed his eyes shut tightly, trying desperately to hold himself together while the weight of loss crashed over him all at once. Then panic hit him like a violent wave. He stumbled backward away from the piano, breathing heavily as terror filled his face. His chest tightened painfully while tears blurred his vision completely. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet, too empty. He turned away from the piano once more, convinced that he had failed again, convinced he would remain trapped inside his silence forever. In that moment, Elias truly believed he had lost the final connection he still shared with his father, and deep down, he feared that some broken parts of him would simply never heal. Then the wedding day finally arrived. The massive hall overflowed with guests dressed beautifully in black suits and elegant gowns. Warm candlelight glowed softly across the polished wooden floors while whispers drifted nervously through the air. Yet despite the beauty surrounding them, something felt painfully incomplete. No music played, no welcoming melody filled the room. Even the wedding band sat perfectly still with instruments resting silently in their laps. Sarah had requested complete silence for the aisle walk. She wanted everyone in that room to feel the same emptiness she carried every day since losing her father. And slowly that silence became unbearable, heavy, suffocating, almost alive somehow. The great oak doors finally began to open with a long, echoing creak. Every guest turned instantly toward the glowing entryway. And there stood Sarah, beneath the warm golden light, beautiful beyond words, yet heartbreakingly fragile at the same time. Her pale face carried the exhaustion of months spent grieving quietly behind closed doors. Her trembling eyes searched the room carefully before landing on the empty chair holding her father's photograph. The moment she saw it, her composure nearly collapsed completely. A tear slipped silently down her cheek while the room watched in absolute stillness. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, because in that single moment, everyone could feel the painful emptiness standing beside her. Her heel struck the stone floor. Click. The sound echoed loudly throughout the silent hall like a crack through glass. She took another slow step forward, clutching the yellow roses tightly against her chest. Another tear rolled down her face. Another wave of grief crashed over her trembling heart. The silence surrounding her no longer felt peaceful. It felt crushing. Each lonely footstep reminded her that her father was gone forever. Halfway down the aisle, Sarah suddenly stopped walking completely. Her breathing broke unevenly as tears blurred her vision. For one terrifying moment, it looked as though the grief was simply too heavy for her to carry any farther. Then suddenly, a sharp scraping sound shattered the silence. A chair moved violently somewhere in the back rows. Several guests turned in surprise as heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden floorboards. Slow at first, then stronger, more determined. Emerging from the shadows walked Elias, pale, trembling, terrified, but moving forward anyway. The entire room watched in stunned silence as he passed through the sea of shocked faces without stopping. His eyes locked onto the empty grand piano waiting silently near the altar. And for the very first time since their father died, Elias stepped out of the darkness and chose to be heard. The violent scraping sound of the chair shattered the unbearable silence hanging over the wedding hall. Hundreds of startled eyes turned toward the back rows as Elias slowly stepped out from the shadows. His pale face looked terrified, his breathing uneven, yet something inside him had finally changed. For months, grief had buried him so deeply inside himself that he barely felt human anymore. But now, with tearful eyes locked firmly on the shining grand piano near the altar, he forced himself forward through the sea of silent guests. Every slow step across the heavy wooden floorboards felt impossibly difficult, yet he kept walking anyway. Fear trembled through his entire body, but love for his sister pushed him onward. His hands shook violently at his sides as he moved through the dimly lit hall, surrounded by blurred faces and soft golden light. Anxiety tightened painfully around his chest, begging him to turn around before everyone witnessed him fall apart completely. Elias had spent his entire life hiding from attention, hiding from people, hiding from the sound of his own voice. Since their father died, the silence inside him only grew heavier. But seeing Sarah standing alone in her wedding dress, abandoned in the middle of unbearable grief, broke something open inside him. He realized he could no longer stay hidden while his sister carried all this pain alone. Halfway down the aisle, Sarah stood completely frozen as realization slowly spread across her tear-streaked face. Her trembling hand rose shakily to cover her mouth while tears blurred her vision. Since their father's death, Elias had almost disappeared entirely from the world. He barely spoke, barely looked anyone in the eyes, barely allowed anyone close enough to understand the pain swallowing him whole. Yet now, he was walking directly toward the grand piano, with terrified determination burning across his pale face. And suddenly, Sarah understood exactly what he was trying to do. Her heart shattered and healed all at once. The entire hall remained perfectly silent as Elias finally reached the shining grand piano, resting beneath the warm lights near the altar. Even the wedding band sitting nearby stared toward him motionlessly, too emotional to breathe. Earlier that day, Sarah had chosen complete silence for the ceremony because she wanted everyone to feel the emptiness left behind by their father's absence. And until this moment, that silence felt crushing, heavy enough to suffocate the room itself. But now the silence had changed. Now it felt sacred, like the entire world was quietly waiting for one broken soul to finally speak again. Slowly, Elias lowered himself onto the polished piano bench. Against the massive grand piano, he looked heartbreakingly small and fragile. His trembling hands rested motionless in his lap while his eyes remained fixed on the black and white keys before him. Memories crashed into him all at once. Warm Sunday mornings, soft sunlight spilling across the living room floor, his father sitting beside him patiently teaching him how to turn emotions into music. Elias swallowed hard as tears burned in his eyes again. He had spent months avoiding these memories because they hurt too much to carry. But tonight, sitting before the piano once more, those memories no longer felt like wounds alone. They felt like love refusing to disappear. Very slowly, his shaking hands lifted toward the piano keys. Every movement looked uncertain, fragile, terrified. The polished surface reflected softly beneath the warm cinematic lights, while the entire hall held its breath in complete silence. Elias could feel panic rising again inside his chest. His breathing became shallow, his throat tightened painfully. That familiar fear inside his mind begged him to stop before he embarrassed himself in front of everyone. But then he looked towards Sarah standing alone in the aisle, tears pouring endlessly down her face. And suddenly Elias understood something important. This moment was no longer about fear. It was about love. Then finally, one trembling finger gently pressed down against a single white key. The soft piano note echoed quietly through the massive wedding hall, like light breaking through endless darkness. Such a small sound, yet powerful enough to make several guests instantly burst into tears. Elias froze after hearing the note resonate around the room. That single sound carried every emotion trapped inside him for months. Every sleepless night, every unfinished sentence, every memory of his father's voice fading further away with time. Slowly another note followed, then another. A fragile melody began forming beneath his shaking hands, soft and uncertain at first, as though the music itself was afraid to exist after so much silence. But with every passing note, something inside Elias slowly began changing. His breathing steadied, his shoulders relaxed. The fear controlling him loosened its grip while emotion poured freely through the piano instead. Tears slipped down his cheeks as he closed his eyes tightly, no longer caring who saw him breaking apart. The melody flowing through the hall carried everything he had been unable to say aloud since their father died. Pain, love, grief, memory, longing. It was not perfect music. It was honest music, and honest music reaches deeper into the human heart than perfection ever could. Sarah felt her knees weaken as the melody wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Every note sounded painfully familiar, carrying echoes of childhood mornings spent listening to their father play inside the old family home. For the first time all day, the unbearable loneliness crushing her chest began to soften. It felt as though her father had somehow returned to walk beside her through the music flowing from Elias's trembling hands. Tears streamed endlessly down her face, but now they carried something more than grief, gratitude, relief, love so overwhelming it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. Throughout the grand hall, guests openly wiped tears from their faces while listening to the fragile, emotional melody filling the air. Some quietly held each other's hands, others lowered their heads while trying unsuccessfully to stop crying. Even the priest standing near the altar looked deeply emotional as the music surrounded the room. Nobody there would ever forget this moment, because they were not simply watching someone play a piano. They were witnessing a frightened young man fighting his way back toward life through courage, vulnerability, and love. As the melody grew stronger, Sarah slowly began walking forward again. Her footsteps no longer sounded painfully lonely against the wooden floorboards. Now they moved gently beside the music echoing around her from every direction. She clutched the faded yellow roses tightly against her chest while tears continued slipping freely down her cheeks. Yet through all the heartbreak, a soft, radiant smile slowly appeared on her face. The pain of losing her father still existed inside her heart, but it no longer felt impossible to survive. Elias had stepped beside her in the only way he knew how, through music. At the piano, Elias pressed the keys more confidently now, surrendering completely to the emotions flowing through him. His fingers moved across the instrument with heartbreaking sincerity, while tears continued falling from his closed eyes. He remembered his father softly telling him long ago that music speaks when words fail. Back then, Elias never fully understood those words, but tonight he finally did, because the melody filling the wedding hall was saying everything his broken heart never could. Finally, Sarah reached the warmly glowing altar and slowly turned back toward the distant grand piano. Her tear-streaked face glowed softly beneath the golden lights as she looked toward her younger brother with overwhelming pride and love. At that exact moment, Elias slowly opened his wet eyes and looked back at her through blurred tears. Across the massive hall, the siblings locked eyes silently while the melody continued surrounding them both. Neither needed words anymore. Everything existed inside that single glance. The final piano note echoed softly through the hall before fading gently into silence once more. Elias's trembling hands rested motionless against the keys while his chest rose and fell unevenly. For several long seconds, nobody moved at all. Then suddenly, quiet sobs spread throughout the crowd again. Elias slowly stood up from the piano bench, his pale hands still shaking softly at his sides. But his face looked peaceful now, lighter somehow, as though some unbearable weight inside him had finally loosened after months of silence and pain. Without hesitation, Sarah rushed across the floor toward him. Her white wedding dress flowed behind her, while tears streamed endlessly down her smiling face. The moment she reached Elias, she wrapped her arms tightly around his neck and pulled him into a fierce emotional embrace beside the shining grand piano. Elias collapsed into the hug immediately, burying his face against her shoulder, while years of grief finally shattered completely inside him. His body shook violently with sobs he had hidden for far too long, while Sarah held him tighter, crying openly beside him. Near the glowing grand piano, Elias's pale hands finally rested peacefully against the black and white keys, no longer trembling with fear, no longer pulling away from the world. Warm golden light filled the wedding hall completely now, replacing the unbearable heaviness that once suffocated the room earlier that day. The pain of losing their father would never fully disappear. Some wounds remain forever stitched into the human heart. But for the first time since his death, both brother and sister finally understood something beautiful. Silence may follow heartbreak for a while, but love always finds a way to speak again.